Welcome to the Moral Metacyst. You know, diplomacy and what is the same meta diplomacy can be very stressful at times. And so I thought that to open up this episode, we would do a sort of guided meditation to calm our nerves and allow us to act dispassionately. So close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine yourself sinking into a swamp or bog or muskeg. Imagine your feet sinking into the warm mud. Imagine your knees, your waist, your ribs sinking into the warm mud. Imagine the feeling of your neck sinking into the mud. And your entire body warm, mucky. Only your face in the cool air looking up at the sky. Now, imagine yourself on a diplomacy board. Think of your opening moves as each of the powers. Who would your ideal ally be? Maybe it's the spontaneity and the love at first sight that a new in-game relationship that inspires you and calms you. Or maybe it's the presence of an old friend, one you know, or maybe one you've lost. What power is speaking to you? England, Austria, Russia, the Ottomans? Whichever one you find the most peace with. For me, that power will be Italy. Now imagine your friends, new or old, is assigned the very power that your playstyle, your philosophy most dictates an alliance with. For me, that is an easy, almost stereotypical one. My friend is Austria. Imagine you're having so much fun just talking to your ally that you know you'll both make it far to this game. Perhaps in the back of your minds, you know that either you or they don't have the impulse control to not betray you at some point. Or maybe you have a certain certainty. Maybe you have a plan in place in 1901 for the entire game. Or maybe it's the endless possibilities of chance and passion that you find most peaceful. Imagine the four great seas on the board. The North Sea, the Mid-Atlantic Ocean, the Ionian and the Black Sea. Now, think about, instead of the limits of trust being leaving these seas open, from the very beginning, you can share these tiles with your ally. If you were England, you ask France to enter into the channel to help your attack on Germany. A juggernaut, you are both offering each other the Black Sea. It's too important to leave empty. Either you move to disband Russia's fleet in Romania, or perhaps Russia is given the Black Sea. A convoy streaks from Armenia into Romania.
And then there's what I think is the most beautiful act of trust, where imagine you're Germany and you're allowing people to pass through Munich. You're giving France a corridor into the east. Or you're giving my beloved Italy Munich so they can build an extra fleet. Deceiving the board, delaying the alliances that will later form against you and I, Italy. You push me out of Munich and I retreat into Burgundy, Silesia, wherever you want. And that brings us to the end of this meditation. Open your eyes if you had them closed, or your inner eye if you had them open. And let's discuss the salient topic of this episode, which is the different kinds of meta.
We'll be discussing various categories of meta diplomacy, and I do want to preface this by saying that these categories are by no means exhaustive, and as you'll see, there are quite a few hybrid forms that are not mutually exclusive, like metagaming itself. One nests within the other. If you can think of any more good examples or categories of meta diplomacy, subcategories, or what have you, please feel free to message me or send me an email, and I might kind of append it onto our list. Without further ado, here are 5 types of meta diplomacy.
The first kind of meta we're going to discuss is what I call quantitative meta. I would say it's more colloquially known as scoring meta, but I don't think that encompasses the way in which the quantification of all aspects of this game can be used in order to gain an edge or to manipulate others. I discussed this at some length in the Weasel Moot channel in the North American Diplo Federation. Not sure if I'm getting that right. There's so many diplomacy meta servers, and at some point I will give the listeners a map to that labyrinth, and also tell them where to maybe check back every now and again to keep abreast of things. So at the risk of repeating myself, I think I am going to read from my statement there and add a few things.
Quantitative metacysts are adept at using scoring systems and tournament structure to manipulate in a seemingly dispassionate way. The best will even make you feel that to go against their argument is to go against rationality itself. somehow the agreements tend to steadily tip in their favor, a slow, painful death. I'll confess that I often wish I was better at quantitative meta, but a certain ineptitude can also inoculate one to quantitative meta. Allow you to sniff it out, as David Hood says. I also have a great quantitative meta advisor. Now, I will note that I do have permission to name my advisor, and it is Pixie, who we kind of came up together in Season 3. He's an old friend of mine, and someone who really opened my eyes to scoring meta when he got into a speedboat finals through a wildcard game and promptly laid the smackdown because of my complete misunderstanding of the two-part structure of those finals. But to return to this, I write, of course, the I'm bad at math LOL argument is also a common kind of parasitism and sandbagging, much like the I'm bad at tactics approach that Ed Sullivan has turned into an art form. I will actually read the second part just because I do want to emphasize that there are always hybrid forms of these categories and that they do not exhaust all the categories of meta. And so I write, horse trading, aka cross gaming, is a little different as it is a sort of hybrid form, both social meta and quant meta. I've never had the social standing to be offered a horse trade, though I've been on the sharp end of one. Now, to give some next examples, which are the ones I'm familiar with, one of the most amusing and audacious ones I've witnessed was when Pezza di Merda, and he did this through intermediaries, which lent a certain kind of scientific veneer to the deception, pulled off what I called, I believe at the time, the 32.5 deception. And this was where, I believe on a daily basis, Nexus officials posted the current minimum score you would need to advance to the second round, igniting a wave of people making agreements for various kind of draws, 2 and usually 3-way draws that would get everyone supposedly into the second round. Now, of course, this was entirely designed to benefit quantitative metacysts like Pez, who in fact snuck into the second round despite my best efforts. A historical example would also include the early Pez years when he was still the nascent Robespierre, an insurgent leader rather than the Caesar of Nexus, and he started the tradition of what I call the targeting index. And he was vying for the 7th place spot ever, the spot that Pezza di Merda is vying for in the Nexus finals, and he started this tradition of publishing a daily report on the results that were rolling in and what score you would need to obtain to get a spot in the finals, both encouraging the kind of horse trading that he specializes in, as well as encouraging others to drag down his rivals at the bottom of the final standings.
Now, I really struggled with what to call this next kind of meta. At first, I want to call it psychological, but as I gave it some thought, began to think that physiological or physical, even perhaps would be the closest approximation to what I mean here, would be better terms. In a sense, though, it's kind of immaterial because by chance they all begin with P's. So let's just call it PM. And the reason for this confusion and a window into what this kind of meta entails is probably easiest to grasp through examples, right? My issues with the term psychological are that, firstly, I think that a lot of what we dub psychological phenomena are really sociocultural ones. And secondly, though a related point, what I mean by psychological, physiological, physical in this sense is how the sensory, spatial, temporal environment and the manipulation of that around another player is used as a kind of metagame. Examples. For instance, in online play with 24-hour turns, you can use time zone differences to know when someone is asleep, what the best time to perhaps flip their ally is, all sorts of unpleasant surprises. This is why you'll find that, for instance, on Nexus and some of the online communities, really the best players never seem to sleep. They'll respond to you at any time. Now, players that never sleep, and this is a gross generalization, often they tend to be extremely controlling players, very legalistic, just always obsessively trying to bind you to agreements, perhaps mathematically minded. A lot of you are probably like me and kind of at a significant disadvantage in that way. Being a bit more easygoing perhaps makes you likable, but also makes you a bit of a pushover, and couple that with, perhaps a more aesthetically minded kind of disposition. It's difficult to compete with these types, but there are ways to turn that to your advantage, and some of the really truly great players can be both controlling and use these counter-controlling techniques. So for instance, interruption of feeding and sleep cycles, very well-known interrogation technique, really since the dawn of human sociality, I would say. In that sense, you're coming home from a party, that your controlling partner will jump at any chance to answer your texts. Never forget to send them a messy text. Signing up for tournaments at the very last minute to achieve an element of surprise when you appear, whether virtually or in person, would also qualify as a kind of PM. This is maybe best exemplified by Ed's last minute sign up for Weasel Moot this weekend. And I expected that move. Not that I'm great at anticipating his moves, but one kind of PM that I'm almost positive has and does happen in face-to-face is the use of variable tolerances, sensitivities, and proclivities for intoxication. And again, remember that diplomacy and meta-diplomacy styles are always an extension of the personality, and having your friends perhaps have a few more drinks in the name of raucous friendship might not be something that was drawn up in advance, but it could be something that has a effect on the outcome of a game. You could say, in fact, that narco meta is almost a subcategory of PM. Now, speaking of subcategories, some of you might be surprised that I don't speak about sexual meta under the heading of PM, and that's for a few reasons. I mean, in the most explicit, blunt way, it reflects the fact that while there may be a physiology of undifferentiated desire, sexuality and gender to me should be classed as a sociocultural category. And by that I mean both sexual practice and expression of gender depends on the categories that are available to play with, as well as open to kind of chemical and intervention, increasingly, in fact, as well as simple kind of changes in body adjacent ornamentation. But though that might seem controversial to some, and it's definitely not something I have all the answers to, I think that my statement that sexual meta, the use of seduction, conscious or unconscious, falls squarely into the social and cultural meta categories, when you consider that so much of diplomacy is played through text, often anonymously, and you can find countless examples of people, even faking their gender or sexual alignment in order to get what they want, flirting, feigning interest, and that, well, in that sense, it's almost the throws into the relief the way in which love, as we discussed in the last podcast on love and power, Pez and Eber, is always for the idea and the person as the vessel for that idea.
Sexual desire is really cultivated through practice. In that sense, the relationships that you engage in over the years train you, right, in a kind of sexual technique and practice that then shapes and guides your desires. And of course, there's also the way in which we are trained through videographic means how to do and want these things. It's also increasingly malleable through the intervention of not only video, as we mentioned, but drugs, hormones, as well as simple changes in body adjacent ornamentation. To be clear, I do not deny the importance of sexual diplomacy and what is the same sexual meta diplomacy. I merely think that it should be classed differently than some people would expect. It's not primarily physiological, physical, or psychological. Rather, I would say that the strategic use of gender would be cultural, whereas the strategic use of sexuality would be predominantly social.
Now, I'm going to treat social and cultural meta side by side, and not because I want to collapse them into a single category, but simply because the concepts are usually confused, and I want to keep them distinct and emphasize what is different about them. So my notions of social and cultural meta here are in many ways derived from Pierre Bourdieu's concepts of social and cultural capital, which he advances in his book Distinction and Elsewhere. Now, the differences between the two is that social meta, it tends to be it's much more often consciously strategic. It is the fluctuating web of your personal relationships and your knowledge of other interpersonal relationships, your ability to predict them, and this is where this idea of social capital comes in. Your ability to mobilize them for economic, in the sense of diplomacy, you could say it's an economy of the dots or centers benefit. And this, of course, is pretty, I think, easy to understand in game, right? It can amount to nothing more than being charming, being polite, showing interest in people's lives, being a decent human being. Often there are a few people who are unable to do those basic things, and the board will eliminate them pretty rapidly. I think the similarity in the words social meta, social media, they do help conceptually understand what social meta is in terms of a kind of shifting network of relationships. But let's not confuse meta and media, right? Because meta is explicitly that, those forms of tactics, sociality, kind of cultural affiliation that are formed across different media, right? Between, within, and outside of games. So to give some examples, just having friends or people you can work well with within the community that you operate, be that face-to-face, WebDip, Nexus, what have you. Form of social meta, and important to attend to. Also a knowledge of where people stand in the social structure, the hierarchies and forms of distinction within various diplomacy meta servers where they hang out and where they cultivate their social meta. It's also worth noting it also encompasses kind of socioeconomic inequalities and inequities in the sense that, for instance, to be able to afford to go to all the tournaments, to buy drinks for people, etc., it does give you an edge in social meta, and the buying drinks may be a little narco meta. Whereas social meta is decentralized, the kind of living history of your social relationships, and largely open to conscious strategy. Cultural meta, it tends to be largely unconscious and much more fixed. Cultural categories are inscribed deeply into the body. They're inhabited. Cultural categories would include race, gender, class, caste in certain societies. You'll find, for instance, that because the diplomacy hobby is predominantly white men, that their form of solidarity, the cultural meta that they're benefiting from, often unconsciously, tends to express itself in a shared play style that is sometimes referred to, and I think we should see the coded elements here quite clearly, a kind of purism. This would be advanced, for instance, by the diplomacy briefing and others. It's basically an idea that social meta is in fact the evil, bad, cheating meta, friendships, etc., because they benefit from being part of a pre-existing cultural category with a kind of more organic sort of solidarity. And you can, I think Russell Dennis articles are great for this. He's always railing against it. And the reason for that, I think, is because subaltern groups, right, because they don't have a pre-existing cultural solidarity, cultural metagame, they often have to engage in more forms of social meta, i.e., kind of creating safe spaces, secret meta servers, in order to achieve a social meta that can compete with the cultural meta of the hegemonic group. Now, cultural meta doesn't have to be these kind of deeply inscribed categories with a longer history. One of the interesting things is if you really explore the ecology of different diplomacy meta servers and platforms, you'll find that each of the each of the arenas available does have a bit of its own culture. Often those are partially long-term accumulated effects of incentives.
This brings us to our fifth and final type of meta, which I will call tactical meta. In its simplest form, tactical meta simply refers to whatever strategies are in fashion and how to exploit, counter, and perfect those strategies. It's a use of the word meta that is mostly found in the gunboat community, and especially the speedboat and to a lesser extent the blitz community, where these fashions tend to cycle more rapidly. One example of this was pioneered last fall by the aforementioned Pixie, who noticed that there was a mania for English players who were opening to the channel, making an aggressive attack on France, who has every reason to move to the mid-Atlantic Ocean. This led Pixie to repopularize the northern opening for Russia, where the army goes to St. Petersburg. He had his own mania for alliances with Austria, hoping to DMZ Galicia. We can clearly see how this would catch a dandy Great Britain with their pants down, insofar as with only a single fleet in the North Sea to contest Norway, Russia can either keep England from taking Norway or simply suck that fleet into Norway, while Germany takes the North Sea. The simple threat of Germany taking the North Sea inhibits England from moving. Anything that involves exploiting the mechanics of the game and the trends around those forms of exploitation can be referred to as tactical meta. As such, tactical meta encompasses practices such as tactical NMRs, waved builds, and draws, which are both proposed and turned down by the same player in order to frame and rally against the board leader. Another example of tactical meta involves sending allies and rivals articles, YouTube videos, and what have you produced by various diplomacy legends, experts, champions, and using these articles in order to convince them that it is not only reasonable, but traditional and correct that they do what you want. Using outside sources also has the benefit, especially in an anonymous game, of cloaking your own hand in coming up with these schemes, while appropriating the authority of those who produce the content. And let us not forget, if you control your own diplomacy empire, you can produce, edit, and distribute this content for your own tactical meta purposes. At its most esoteric, tactical meta may also involve exploiting the particularities of different platforms of diplomacy. For example, the famous convoy kidnapping maneuver that the Backstabber platform allows.
All right, it's mailbag time. The first message comes from Captain Meme. I like to call him Captain Scheme. A lot of people call him Cap Meme. His real name is Marcus. Funny guy, popular guy. He runs a diplomacy YouTube channel that I believe is called Diplostrats. I really hope I'm not getting that wrong. Please correct me in the comments if I am. But he writes, "Your pod is interesting. I've watched both through, but I wouldn't really call it diplomacy content. It's like meta hobby drama analysis. Puzzling because first of all, diplomacy is meta hobby drama analysis. Second of all, Marcus's videos and the advice he gives, it really tends to be advice given as if each diplomacy game was being played in a vacuum in this kind of idealized purist way. And I must confess, I don't really see the value of the 10,000th video on Austrian openings where you're once again advised to do the Balkan Gambit. Almost every game of diplomacy as it is currently played is played within the framework of tournament structures, ranking systems, is subject to meta servers, etc. So in a sense, I actually find that my approach is far more realistic. And I think that in some ways that he is giving advice for his fantasy of the game. The next piece of fan mail comes from Diplomat's commentator and Nexus thug, Lexus Luthor and Eric Grinnell. It's one of hundreds that he has sent me. However, I'll keep it short as I think this encapsulates his feelings about the show. Here, he sends me a suicide hotline number and then encourages me to end my life. That's not very nice, Eric. Now, I did have a few more pieces of fan mail, but running out of time in Steam, and so I think I will leave it there. It seems somehow fitting to end the podcast on that absolutely dismal note. But fear not, some of the other pieces of mail I got and messages are far more positive, uplifting, and I will get to them in the next episode. Thanks for listening.
Good times, my beloved listeners. At the risk of tooting my own horn, I've got to say, it's like Zach said, MM3, it was a fucking banger.